He was going to throw them in prison for other people to murder them. All right? So we can call him whatever we want, but he was a terrorist for Christians. And what happened on the road when he was blinded?
God spoke to him.
Okay, God spoke to him and he responded. And, I mean, was his life changed?
Not yet.
Hmm?
It was changed whenever he got to the town and somebody told him to do something, he did it, and then he was brought to the Lord.
Okay. All right, we see he talks into the light there. There's this interaction. I don't know how much he knew at that point. I know he was blinded for the next few days. And then a guy comes in and he immediately begins to share the gospel. Now, the Christians aren't really receiving of him because they know who he is. You see, in his life, he goes from being absolutely loved by the people that he was part of, the Jews. I mean, he was one of the best, one of the elite. And then he becomes a Christian, and he's hated by the Christians. But then, after a while, he's loved by the Christians. And now we find him hated by who? The Jews. So he's pretty much managed to make everyone mad and everyone happy throughout his lifetime. All right, he swapped his group of friends pretty regular. And there were times in his life where he was completely alone other than with God. And he begins to share in this passage his conversion. And in chapter 22, for quite a few verses, he shares about how he was converted on the road to Damascus and how God spoke to him and how he spoke back to God and said, "Who are you, Lord?" Remember those words when he speaks to the Lord? And God says, "Christ whom you're persecuting." So he identifying. So as he's speaking to these people, understand that they would have understood exactly what he was saying. And he was proclaiming to them that Jesus Christ was the Lord, and that Christ told him to go and to take the gospel to the Gentiles. They did not want to hear this, but Paul wanted to tell them. It was a message of the gospel that was going to fall on deaf ears at this time. But here's the truth about that. It didn't change the message, did it? The gospel is still good news, whether it's received or not. Now, the application is obviously not good, right? I mean, if someone rejects the gospel, what do they inherit? Somebody say hell. Hell. Okay? If they reject the gospel, they reject God, they inherit eternal destruction. But the good news is the gospel is still offered. The good news is still always the cross. So whether it's received or rejected, it doesn't change the fact that Christ died is good news. That's what Paul had good news. And like any reasonable person with good news, he shared it, even though it was going to cause a big uproar. All right, so ultimately this falls on deaf ears. They tell him, they say, "No, you go away. All right, we send him away, take him away. We want him dead." And we're going to see in a second, they're going to start plotting to kill him. All right? So then they take him away, and he now stands before the court, the tribunal. All right? The Roman tribunal. Up to this word, they listened to him. Then they raised their voice and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth." This is chapter 22, verse 22. "For he should not be allowed to live." And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging. So here's what they're going to do. They're going to question him, and the way they're going to start is by beating him. All right, so the soldiers have got him. Obviously, this is a bad dude because he's caused this riot amongst the people. We can't really get an answer out of him that we understand. He's talking about hearing voices, and he's talking about God speaking to him. I mean, this is their thoughts with this guy, so we're just going to beat him until we get something out of him that we like. All right? When they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by him, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen." So the tribune came to him and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" He said, "Yes." citizenship for a large sum, Paul said, but I am a citizen by birth. So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. And the tribunal also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. All right, so this was against the law for them to do. Since Paul was a Roman citizen, they had no authority over him. All right, now they could do what they want with the Jewish people because they were servants. But Paul was a Roman citizen, and he had not been given any type of sentence. He would have had a fair trial, and that would have been the policy for someone of Roman citizenship. And Paul was. He had purchased it at some point in his life. You could purchase citizenship. And so here we see them terrified, standing in front of Paul, and they're about to beat him when Paul says, hey, you know I'm a Roman citizen, right? I mean, I think you see in this story God sparing him. You see God kind of stepping in. But we also see Paul's willingness all the way through this to die, just as Christ did. I mean, think about all the similarities up to this point. That he goes to Jerusalem knowing that it's been told to him that if he goes to Jerusalem, he'll die. That sounds similar to Christ. Christ went into Jerusalem, riding victoriously, and just a few days later he was murdered on a cross. We see Paul submits himself to the same thoughts, the same idea. He's persecuted by the same people, those religious elite. He's standing before some of the same soldiers, the Roman soldiers. But in this case, though Jesus' trial takes a different turn, we see grace in Paul's trial. All right, but on the next day, verse 30 of 22. On the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. And looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before those who stood by him to strike him on the mountain. I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Okay, so this guy's about to hit him, and he looks at him, and he says, God's going to kill you. And then he calls him a whitewashed wall. Now, this was a reference to a tomb. All right? When he calls him a whitewashed wall, the idea was like a beautiful tomb that's nice on the outside, but dead on the inside. When he says God's going to strike you, he's speaking to his condition. Yes, you look good on the outside, you're a Pharisee. But on the inside, you're dead. So Paul is calling him on his relationship with God. He speaks very directly to him, doesn't really realize who he is. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet, contrary to the law, you order me to be struck? Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So Paul puts himself in check and says, okay, I'm going to check my attitude at this point right here. Then when we see this, we see Paul, pretty sneaky guy. All right? And this little section ends like this. He realizes in the room, he was smart, he understood what was going on, that you had two groups of people. You had the Sadducees and the Pharisees. All right? The Pharisees affirmed the resurrection from the dead. The Sadducees denied it. So Paul looks at them and says, I'm a Pharisee. And that's all it takes. It would be like today, standing in the middle of the Senate room, being judged by both Democrats and Republicans, and standing up and going, but I'm a Democrat. Or, I'm a Republican. Immediately, what? Lines are drawn. You have one side that says, I'm for you. You're my boy. You're on my team. And the other side says, I want you dead. I want you out of here. If you're not right, you're what? What's your shirt say?
Wrong.
If you're not right, you're wrong. Right, exactly. That would have been the same attitude that the Pharisees and the Sadducees would have had. So in the middle of this, just by using just a little bit of intelligence, Paul stops for a moment. He goes, well, I'm a Pharisee. Because he believed in the resurrection of Christ. Would have been a little different context than the Pharisees. But he says, I'm a Pharisee. I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And boom, these two sides just start going at each other. So much so that they really kind of forget about Paul. And ultimately, at the end of this, after this big long fight, they throw him into prison to deal with this another day. So they, in the middle of this trial, they forget what they're doing. They get to arguing about their different beliefs. They throw him into a prison. And then you have the whole reason that we did all of these verses in one night. You have one verse. Verse 11 of 23. It says, the following night the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. So God comes and visits Paul that night, pleased with his servant, and says this, in the same way that you came here, you were faithful to testify of me. I'm going to send you on to Rome. Now what did that mean? Well, it mean he wasn't going to die in Jerusalem. Right? If he's going to go to Rome, guess what? Eventually he's going to get out of that jail. We see the grace of God show up in Paul's life because of his faithfulness. Have you ever experienced the grace of God because you were faithful to him? Has there ever been a time in your life where you were tempted to do something else, but because you wanted to serve God, you were faithful, and you knew that that was right, and you felt God's presence? Here in Paul's life, Christ shows up, and he says, hey, in the same way that you were faithful here, I want you to keep going. I want you to go to Rome. And we see that ultimately, without ruining too much of the rest of Acts, he gets out. And he goes to Rome. And he preaches the gospel in Rome. And he goes to Rome a second time. Here's some more bad good news. Eventually, Paul dies. Now, if it had happened in this moment, if it had happened here in Jerusalem, would that have changed Paul's mindset? Would that have changed his love for God? I don't think so. But God grants him another day and another moment and another moment. And as long as he lives, he's faithful to God. And he feels the presence of God on his life. The lesson for us tonight is this. There's a passage in Scripture that says, pick up your cross and follow me. Now, when you put that in an Old Testament context, that's odd. Because the cross was an instrument of death. So what is the call to being a Christian? You follow me no matter where it leads. If it leads to death, if it leads to humiliation. And Paul picked up his cross day after day after day. And what was his reward? His reward is verse 11. Late one night, he's sitting in a jail cell. Everyone that's around him, furious with him, wanting to kill him. God comes, he shows up, he speaks to him, and he offers grace. That's it. And that was enough. That was enough for him to keep going. It was enough for him to go on to Rome. Here's my question tonight. Is that enough for you? If that's all that's offered, if at the end of the day, all of your faithfulness just leads you to be able to look upon Christ, is that okay? Is that enough? Because for the Christian, that's more than enough. What else would we want to look at? Why is it that Paul's faithful because he's got the right perspective of God. And in his faithfulness, God shows up and reveals himself. I think that should be our prayer, day in and day out. That as we're faithful, we just want to see a glimpse of God and experience his grace. Any thoughts? That was a lot of scripture. There's way more in there than what we talked about tonight. So if you want to go back and read it, go check it out. Next week we're going to talk about them trying to kill him while he's in jail. Now you know it's not going to happen because Jesus already told us. All right, let's pray. Gracious God, we love you. Thank you for these students. Thank you for their faithfulness to be here tonight. God, I pray that you would begin to work in this group. Begin to show them their ultimate love is found only in you. God, make them faithful. Make them love you by showing them who you are. Let them get a glimpse, a taste of your goodness. Visit them when they're faithful. Show them your grace. God, let us live as Paul lived, loving our God and faithful to him. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. See you guys next week.
This episode, and see you guys next time.